Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Duncan White, the convener of the Writers Speak series here at the Mahindra Humanities Centre at Harvard. And I'm truly honoured today to be presenting Damon Galgut in conversation with James Wood. Before we get started, I wanted to note that we have one more event in the series this semester. It's our last one of the year, and I hope you can join us for that to hear Carmen Maria Machado in conversation with Laura van den Berg on April the 7th at 6 p.m. Okay, I'm going to keep my introductions brief and get out of the way as quickly as possible. Damon Galgut is the author of 9 books, the most recent of which is The Promise, an astonishing feat of a novel which won last year's Booker Prize. His previous books include The Good Doctor and In a Strange Room, both of which were shortlisted for the Booker. The Promise is a masterful novel that roves through a multitude of perspectives to tell the story of the dissolution of a white South African family, ranging from the social upheaval of the last years of apartheid in the 1980s, through the optimism of the Mandela era, to the decline of that optimism under Mbeki and Zuma. The novel is divided into 4 parts, each of which centres on a funeral. As the title suggests, the novel is animated by the question of whether the family in question will honour the dying mother's promise to give their black servant ownership of the house in which she lives. James Wood is our leading literary critic, a staff writer at The New Yorker and professor of the practice here at Harvard, and of course a distinguished novelist in his own right. His most recent collection of essays is Serious Noticing, which gathers some of the best of his essays from the last 2 decades. James has been a great champion of Damon and The Promise. In his review of the novel in The New Yorker, James wrote that The Promise suggests that the demands of history and the answering cry of the novel can still powerfully converge. Damon has agreed to start us off with a reading from the novel before he and James will begin their conversation. Please note that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen in which you can pose questions, and we'll get to those towards the end of the event tonight. Also, we'll be posting links to both Damon and James's books for purchase at the Harvard bookstore. Okay, over to you, James.
Thank you very much indeed, Duncan, for that terrific introduction, and it's wonderful to be here with Damon. I'll say straight out, Duncan said that I've been a champion of the novel, and I suppose that's true. But it's only right for me to say that actually it was my wife, Claire Massoud, who reviewed this book before me in Harper's. While she was reading The Promise, was reading bits out to me saying, this is the real thing. You've got to read it. So we did a sort of husband and wife team effort on writing about this fabulous novel. It's wonderful to be with Damon again. I think before we get even to the book, I just wanted to ask you a kind of a silly question, really, but your life has perhaps changed a bit in the last 6 months. It's a big thing to win the Booker Prize, and writers can be wary of this kind of attention and adulation. And I'm wondering if you might just talk about that for a second. How has that experience been?
Yeah. Firstly, hi, James. Great to be chatting to you again. And I'm sorry we're not in the same physical space for the conversation, but this is as close as we can get. Yeah, I guess it's been very difficult. You know, there are writers who love publicity and love talking about themselves and their books, and I suppose we all like it to a certain extent, but I've never been completely at ease in that arena, and it's been pretty relentless, actually. But I guess it goes with the territory in the case of this particular prize, and I can't say I wasn't aware that things were going to change. And presumably, you know, the dimmer switch will slowly turn down and life will return to something like it used to be.
Well, when you talk about the dimmer switch, have you had time to think about writing something else yet, or is it still?
I've had time to think about it. I haven't had time to do it. But yeah, there is some, thinking along the way. I was having a conversation with another writer friend and saying that, there is, opportunity. There are little gaps of time in between the other stuff, and I really should use the time, but I'm finding it very difficult. And he said, well, that's not strange, because this kind of endless conversation keeps you on the surface of your life, and that's not where you need to be when you're writing. And that sort of sums it up, I think.
Yeah. Well, look, before we go further, I'd love you to read a little bit from the novel, so the audience can hear you reading your own prose, if you wouldn't mind.
Surely. I have a little piece from fairly early on, and it's a piece that I guess points up, where the title of the book comes from. So in that sense, it's a fairly significant piece. Just to set the scene, the youngest daughter of the Swart family, the white family outside Pretoria that the book is centered on. Her name is Amor, and her mother has died, and she has been brought home from school, but unable to face the gathering in the house, has gone up to a koppie, which is the South African word for a small hill behind the house. And she's looking down, and she's looking at her mother's room, and some of what follows leads straight out of there. I'm reading this off the computer, so I will probably be staring intensely into your eyes as I do it. She can see somebody moving around in there, a female figure bustling about. If she half closes her eyes, Amor can imagine that it really is her mother, her body strong and healthy again, cleaning up the medicine from next to her bed. Not needed anymore. Ma is better again. Time has been turned back. The world is restored. Easy as that. But she knows she's just pretending, and the person in the room isn't Ma. It's Salome, of course, who has been here on the farm forever, or that's how it feels. My grandfather always talked about her like that. Oh, Salome, I got her along with the land. Pause a moment to observe as she takes the sheets off the bed. A stout, solid woman, wearing a second-hand dress, given to her by Ma years ago. A headscarf tied over her hair. She's barefoot, and the soles of her feet are cracked and dirty. Her hands have marks on them too, the scuffs and scars of innumerable collisions. Same age as Ma, supposedly, 40, though she looks older. Hard to put an exact number on her. Not much shows in her face. She wears her life like a mask, like a graven image. But some things you do know, because you saw them yourself. In the same impassive way that Salome sweeps and cleans the house and washes the clothes of the people who live in it, she looked after Ma through her last illness, dressing and undressing her, helping her to bathe with a bucket of hot water and a lappy, helping her to go to the toilet, yes, even wiping her ass for her after she used the bedpan, mopping up blood and shit and pus and piss, all the jobs that people in her own family didn't want to do. Too dirty or too intimate. Let Salome do it. That's what she's paid for, isn't it? She was with Ma when she died, right there next to the bed. Though nobody seems to see her, she's apparently invisible. And whatever Salome feels is invisible too. She has been told, clean up here, wash the sheets. And she obeys. She cleans up. She washes the sheets. But Amor can see her through the window, so she's not invisible after all. Thinking about a memory, not understood till now, of an afternoon just 2 weeks ago in that same room with Ma and Pa. They forgot I was there in the corner. They didn't see me. I was like a black woman to them. I'll leave that there.
Fantastic, thank you, Damon. And we will certainly get to we'll get to Salome in a minute as a crucial presence absence in the book. But before doing that, I wondered if I might just Duncan did a fabulous job of describing the frame of the novel, almost fable-like in its starkness. 4 sections: the funeral of the matriarch, the funeral of the patriarch, the funeral of the elder sister, and then the funeral of the eldest son, and going through that, the surviving witness, Amor, who sees everything and who crucially witnessed the promise that gives the novel its title, a promise by the Swart family mother that when she died, Salome would get to own the house that she lives on the farm, on the family farm. So that's the shape of the novel for those who haven't yet read it. I don't think I'm giving anything away, and it would be hard to discuss it with you today anyway without that. But I wanted to start just by, before we get to the radicalism of the book, and I think it really does take risks, and there are beautiful adventures that you go on with the use of this narrator that we could just hear as you were reading. I wanted to talk about some of the more, should we say, traditional elements of the novel, in particular thinking about this idea of the farmhouse novel. I'm not at all learned in this, but as far as I know, it could be said, I suppose, that as say in English fiction, there's a bit of a tradition of the country house novel, where the country house comes to represent the nation, and maybe there's something similar perhaps in German fiction too, with houses and families. That I know that in South African literature there is, both perhaps in Afrikaans and in English, there's the form of the farm novel or the Plaasroman. And I know that J.M. Coetzee, in his early novel In the Heart of the Country, was doing a kind of postmodern variation on that, which was meaningful to you when you were a young reader and writer.
Is that a question?
Yes, I wondered if you just talk about that and see, what that tradition, and perhaps particularly Coetzee's rewriting of it, meant to you as a young writer, and then how you set about doing your radical rewriting in The Promise.
Yeah, I should stress that I have no academic background at all. Everything that I've learned, if indeed I've learned anything about novels, has come through the reading of them, and to some extent, I suppose, the writing of them too. But even through my reading, of course, I'm aware that the Plaasroman, the farm novel, is a staple element of the South African literary diet. And it began, I guess, as part of the original colonial project, and was, in a sense, initially intended to be, a part of the project of taming the land, certainly making it, the colonial project seem more palatable, giving the sense that this was perhaps an empty landscape that needed to be peopled and needed to be civilized and so on. So, marvelous that there are books like Story of an African Farm, the famous Olive Schreiner novel, is no doubt part of that tradition. And I guess, in more recent times, there's been some sort of pushback against that particular paradigm. You mentioned the Coetzee, but before I encountered the Coetzee, and perhaps a book that is more present, really, or was more present in the writing of this one, is Nadine Gordimer's The Conservationist, where, basically a white city man buys a piece of property outside the city to use as a sort of country retreat. And she raises all, the more modern and troubling questions about ownership of the land and so on. And her central motif is this: there is a black man who dies and who is buried semi-secretly on the farm, but his body continually rises to the surface, as indeed, far more disturbing questions about land ownership keep rising to the surface. Coetzee's book was slightly different. I mean, it is very much a farm novel, and he was, I suppose, in a much more intellectual way, working in and against the usual tradition. But I also sort of read it as a metaphor, I guess, about the futility of intellectual life, perhaps in South Africa, that on this farm, thoughts spiral endlessly inward, lead nowhere, and so on. So perhaps his project is a little bit different. But yes, I was aware of the tradition, and perhaps not aware enough to be subverting it in conscious ways of my own. But I was definitely aware that the farm novel occupies this particular corner of the South African psyche. You, in your absolutely wonderful New Yorker piece, cited the end of E.M. Forster's book, Howard's End, which famously is a kind of image of family belonging and connection, I think, or at least that's how I would read it. And that sense of belonging and connection is well nigh impossible in South Africa, I guess, because ownership is contested, and rightly so. So that even those who occupy the dwelling on the land can never rest easy. There's no sense that the future is assured, or that the past is beyond reproach. So the farm novel in South Africa, while it might have begun as a project of taming and consolation, these days I think can do nothing but sort of rake over the coals of old wounds and unanswered questions.
And you, as soon as you understood yourself to be writing a novel that located itself on a piece of land like that, in one family, you instinctively you understood all the terms you've been talking about, that a certain baggage was inescapable. Is that right?
Well, if you're even a sort of semi-conscious South African, you're aware of these things. I mean, you don't really even need to be aware of the tradition of the farm novel to know that land is very much at the center of South African political life, and a point of great ideological friction. But my project is not, of course, ideological. I saw the potential for drama, I guess, but yes, the potential to dramatize very particular and relevant issues.
Yeah. No, the reason I asked was thinking, again, thinking back to Coetzee and the famous thing he says in the Jerusalem speech about, South African literature is a literature in bondage. It's always going to represent a sort of stunted interior life, deformed and stunted and so on, because that's the nature of the political system. That's quite I just asked that question about, the terms in which you write as a South African writer, because that's a fairly forbidding imprisonment for writers, either black or white. And you can totally understand why, for instance, you might want to, as you did in 2014, write a novel about E.M. Forster going to India, just to not be writing about South Africa for once.
Well, certainly. I mean, that was most definitely one of the, motivations for going Forster's way, is that, the words South Africa never cropped up. He did pay a visit, I discovered in my research, to Cape Town, but much later, and a brief visit too. But, it was a way, I guess, of looking at the same questions in a different context, because, questions of empire and ownership applied to India too.
Yeah.
But, it may or may not be of interest, a different book of mine, In a Strange Room, also represented an attempt on my part to get away from this bondage you mentioned. I found a solution in the form of travel, I guess. As a traveler, I remain a South African, but at least I'm not a South African in South Africa, and am in that sense free of, all the usual plug-in points that society will surround you with. So in a sense, if you want to escape from these pressing South African obligations, you have to remove yourself physically in order to remove yourself thematically as well. But otherwise, yes, our recent history, I guess, is just too recent to have been left behind. We are not at a point where we are looking back, with regret or any other sort of emotion at the apartheid era. It's still very much with us, well, in multiple ways, as I guess my book might illuminate.
Yeah. The novel, as I said earlier, has this wonderful controlling narrator who weaves in between characters, can hop from character to character, at a party, at a funeral, at nighttime, going through different walls of bedrooms and so on. And it's the thing, I suppose, that stylistically is most striking about the book. I wanted to ask you just about that choice and the freedoms and maybe limitations that you felt that imposed as you were writing it.
I'd started the book in a far more traditional square-on approach, I guess, and I'd done a little bit of, and I got offered this chance to write a couple of drafts of a film script, which proved to be sort of key in a serendipitous way, because when I came back to the book, I suddenly saw that there was another way to approach this narrative. I mean, I had done a bit of this jumping of point of view In a Strange Room, jumping between,
First
a first person and a third person point of view. And I'd been quite excited by it and what it allowed me. But, you can't just transplant a technique because you like the technique. It's got to be rooted in the material in some way. And I had not found a justification in a subsequent book for that sort of, well, that sort of technique, which, if it didn't have a justification, would just be trickery, really, sort of a gimmick. But suddenly this filmic approach gave me a language that seemed to authentically provide a premise for that kind of, I don't know what you would call it, the very, very rapid shift from one point of view to another.
Yeah.
In a cinematic sense, but the camera obviously is the determining factor where cinema is concerned, and the camera can only occupy a physical space, whereas language is not bound by that limitation. You can travel into the minds of characters. So in effect, using the cinematic language was just a beginning, because you really could travel emotionally from one point of view to another point of view, and of course make physical jumps, sometimes from one location to another, sometimes from one character's point of view to another. And in the same way that I'd felt excited by it when I was working on In a Strange Room, it twanged my writerly strings internally, and I felt, yes, this is satisfying me, which I suppose you only make a departure like that if, in some sense, unconsciously, you're already frustrated with the limitations you're feeling. And I think that was true with this book. I think it would have been a very different and probably quite a dreary book if I'd approached, the recounting of this family saga from a much more stable or fixed point of view. But it seemed to, yeah, it allowed me to open it up internally and you know, to achieve real closeness to particular characters at certain moments, so close that, you know, allowed the narrative to lapse into a first person voice and to speak from inside people at certain times, and then at other moments to pull right back and become a cold, almost inhuman, godlike I. And I loved the range that it established, while also not being sure that that range was workable, because I guess the normal range for a novel is much narrower, and probably for very good reason.
Right. I mean, there are going to be readers who don't like that kind of narration, and I think you've had a review or two, which shall be nameless. You know, complaining about that. But for me, it's tremendously exciting. First of all, as you say, it gives it. Why not allow the novelist to have that freedom? Something that's somewhat been, you know, that we miss a bit. I think that from, you know, that say modernism allowed itself, Virginia Woolf, Faulkner, and so on, allow themselves quite freely to, you know, Virginia Woolf wants to write 20 pages in the middle of To the Lighthouse about an uninhabited house, essentially, in which the novelist becomes, you know, time, becomes the wind. Why not? So I saw it as a tremendous freedom, but also that thing you were talking about, the sort of tonal lift, the playfulness that comes in, and then this combination of very close third person, free and direct style, and then a kind of distance, an ironic distance that is like a village chorus or Greek chorus or unidentified free and direct style that I love in writers like Saramago. Saramago does this a lot, but also a favorite novel of mine, I don't know if you know it, A Chronicle of Stone by Ismail Kadari. Beautiful novel, also uses a sort of, it's doing 40 years, the novel does sort of 40 years, I think, maybe it's a while since I've read it, but does a long period of time during the trials of a city during the Second World War and afterwards, and uses this chorus approach, which just allows an ironic distance. I mean, just to give the audience an example, those who haven't read it, when Amor comes back for, I think it's her sister's funeral in 1995, she's been in London, she comes back to a somewhat changed South Africa. Mandela is the president, and Pretoria is busy with tourists and visitors because the Rugby World Cup is on. And we see it through her eyes for a moment, and then we move slightly away from her, and your playful narrator has this line: "Never did the middle of town look like this. So many black people drifting casually about, as if they belong here. It's almost like an African city!" Exclamation mark. And that's funny, right? And it's sort of her and not her at the same time, and really uses that all the flexibility of narrative to do several things at once. That was one of the joys for me of reading the book.
Yeah, I've read some Kadare, but not that particular one. But I've read quite a lot of Saramago, so I know exactly what you mean with that choral effect. And I guess he's doing it for different reasons. But you know, you can't take a narrative approach like the one I have here, where you are moving very, very rapidly between points of view without drawing attention to the fact that you're doing so. And what it establishes is the sense that the narrator is a presence in the book. Again, I should stress, you know, my background is not academic, but it seems to me from my reading that books began in a place where you acknowledged there was a narrator. I mean, the reader got addressed directly, dear reader, and
Right.
And Shakespeare rounds off his plays with a direct address to the audience. And I think books began with the acknowledgement that what we're engaged in here is an artificial representation of reality, but we're both engaged in it as creator and as audience. But then I guess the tradition has been to move away from that and to try actively to conceal the presence of obviously not a first-person narrator, but a third-person narrator, to make the reader feel that they're observing a world through a pane of glass, as it were, and simply receiving the events that are being conveyed. So in a sense, it sort of kicked me back to maybe an earlier form of the novel, but I decided to take what I would hope is a more radical or modern approach, and really to push the presence of the narrator rather than try to conceal it, and to turn it into something of a mystery, because one of the things that's always intrigued me about storytelling is that somebody is telling the story. So you may try to conceal it. You may construct an artificial identity for your narrator, but there is somebody who is relating these words. The words don't simply exist on their own. And that, stories are told for motives, and they have a purpose, and all of those things, all of which may be part of, the invisible machinery usually. But I decided to play it up. And I mean, I guess there's a sense in which the narrator is not stable. It seems to be a different person, if person it is, at different points in the book, and the tone slides around accordingly. And sometimes the narration is taken over, or seems to be taken over by a particular character, or rather the perception of a particular character takes over the narration. And then we slide off that too into this more detached presence. Which again is probably troubling to some readers, and in fact, some people really battle with that element. But I wanted it to be a question in readers' minds: who is telling the story and why? And I guess the fact that people battle with it is in itself sort of significant. Really, we like our stories to be smooth, and we like the illusion that they're not stories, that we're being presented with something complete and accomplished, whereas stories they're all constructed.
And I thought that was beautifully evident in the passage you read, because you could imagine a conventional realist version of what you read, which would be Amor thinking of her mother, thinking of Salome, and without the self-consciousness that the narrative brings to that act, in just the passage you read out, and a self-consciousness which I think surrounds the narration throughout the novel of Salome, who is given, I think, the tiniest of moments of her own thought, but is essentially, quite intentionally, a loud absence in the novel. And you could see you could hear in the reading that you were doing the establishment of that loud absence. And I wanted to ask you just about that decision.
Yeah, I mean, that's the first time we see Salome in the book. We see her through Amor's eyes and through the window of the room. I early on took the decision that because the book is primarily about or focused on white South Africans, and I'm trying in various ways to recreate, the white South African psyche as I've experienced it. I decided not to allow the narrative to perceive the inner lives of the Black characters in the same way that it is perceiving the inner lives of the white characters. And that's precisely because it's an unfortunate brute fact about South Africa that most white South Africans do not perceive the inner lives of their fellow Black South Africans to the same extent at all. There is a threshold beyond which the white imagination is reluctant to go. Partly, I imagine, out of guilt, and partly out of a kind of rough necessity, because if you do imagine the inner life of another person, you imagine their humanity in its fullness, and you have to take account of, you know, your part in what is a very, very uncomfortable power dynamic.
Yeah.
So it's simply easier for the functioning of a, you know, an unfair, lopsided system like apartheid not to perceive past a certain point.
Right.
Of course, you know, that brings you up against a kind of literary rule, which is that, you know, in the well-made novel, it's expected of you to inhabit,
right.
You know, the soul and psyche of all your major characters, and you lapse in a literary duty if you fail to do so, which is fair enough. I understand the reasoning of it, but I wanted to make a point of not doing so, and to let Salome, who is effectively really the main character of the book, and certainly sits at the heart of the narrative, to let her register as a kind of a blank place in the map. You know, an unanswered question, a knot that hasn't been unpicked, and to let that be as bothersome as possible, I guess, to readers. I did play with the notion of withholding her inner life until a very late point in the book, and then releasing it in a kind of a torrent, so that, you know, the reader might be a little bit overwhelmed by everything that had been held back, and register in that way that, you know, this has been a silence until now. But I opted instead for the device of allowing the narrator, as I have at other points in the book, but maybe nowhere more crucially than at this point, to wheel around and to point a finger out of the page at the reader directly and say, you know, if you had not known these things about Salome, maybe it's because you didn't ask, you didn't care to know. And while that may not be true of all readers, it's certainly true of a great many, and it's certainly true of the vast majority of white South Africans. So that was my thinking, and I've taken an unexpected amount of flack on this particular point. I didn't think it would be quite as contentious a decision as it's turned out to be. Although I should point out that everyone who's had an objection to it, and I think without exception, has been a foreign critic. Nobody in South Africa has questioned this particular approach, because I think it makes a kind of visceral sense to most South Africans.
Yeah.
Even Black readers, they understand exactly what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. While we're on Salome, just to give another example of this wonderful, playful, and quite bitterly ironic narration. It's a couple of lines that I particularly like about Salome's role in bringing up Anton, the troubled eldest son. And the narrator says this of Salome: she has seen him grow up from a tottering infant to a golden boy to this, whatever he is now, tending to him every step of the way. When he was little, he used to call her mama and tried to suck on her nipple, a common South African confusion. That's a pretty good example of exactly that sort of, you know, you're doing 5 different things at once in a couple of lines. I absolutely love it. Well, I think as you were talking about that, I was trying to think of equivalents in, say, British literature, and there aren't very many. I mean, the only ones I can think of are actual silencings, say in the 19th century novel, when someone like George Eliot will say, you know, we don't really need to spend much time with this character because this character doesn't have very interesting thoughts and isn't very educated, and so on. There is a playful and I think deliberately political silencing that I thought of when I was reading your book, that occurs in a favorite novel of mine by Henry Green called Loving, which is it's a country house novel. It's an upstairs downstairs novel, largely about the servants and largely written in their through their dialogue, and they're mostly English Cockney servants who are working in a fancy Anglo-Irish house in Ireland, and when they get together for lunch and dinner in the servants' quarters, they're always joined by a single Irishman who is called Paddy and who is the driver. And Green makes it funny because he doesn't actually silence Paddy, but whenever Paddy talks, none of the others can understand him. He's just muttering something incomprehensible in Irish. So that's a sort of comic version of what of exactly the kind of dynamic you're drawing attention to. Well, there's a lot more to talk about, and particularly I think I'd like to talk to you about the political trajectory, maybe of the novel as it moves from the 1980s to 2018, but maybe we should do that. Maybe we should just check in and see if there are questions from the audience, and we can get back to that if that comes up naturally. So I'll ask Duncan at this point to see if there are any questions.
Yes, we've got some questions coming in, and please remember, if you are listening and you want to ask a question, you can just post it in the Q&A section of the Zoom. So we have one here from Karen Warren. She says, Amor seems so detached from the rest of the white characters in the book. Is that because of her greater sense of awareness and sensitivity about the issues everyone else seems busy ignoring?
I don't want to give too overwhelming an answer, but my approach, not only in this book but in previous ones, is part of a general kind of theory I have about the novel, in which I sort of think the novelistic project, as it originated, was probably to provide middle class consolations to readers, which is to say, ultimately to provide a view of the world that reassures and consoles. So whatever ruptures you've opened up in the world narrative in your book, they need to be resolved by the end, and people who've behaved badly need to have their comeuppance, and people who've behaved well need to have some sort of reward, and so on. And we all take satisfaction from these sorts of balancings in books. But are those balancings true to life? That's another question altogether. They don't always seem to be. I mean, very, very far from it. This is a sort of roundabout way of saying that I'm uneasy about depicting good moral behavior in a narrative. Certainly about depicting it in a way that sets an example for other people, because behind that example presumably is me pointing a way forward, and I don't know a way forward. So if the book has a moral center, it's with Amor. Somebody in this fairly dreadful family had to have the right moral impulse, and she's the person. She's the person, in other words, who she overhears this promise that her dying mother had extracted from her father, that he would give this broken down house on a useless piece of land to this black lady who has looked after her mother through her last illness. And the family is dancing around and finding ways not to fulfill the promise. And Amor is the one person who pushes against that, and who ultimately sees the promise through. But it seems more fitting to me, firstly, that when the promise is fulfilled, that it would be kind of open to contestation and not, you know, a moment of triumph, because such moments are very few and far between in the real world. But more than that, Amor herself, I resist the notion of her as a kind of glowing saint, I guess. So I wanted her to be a little unreadable. You know, she's had this accident as a child that we hear about. When she was 6 years old, she was struck by lightning. And various other family members say at different points, sometimes very specifically in relation to her determination to see the promise through, that there's something wrong with her. She's damaged. She was affected by the lightning strike. And I'd like that to be a possibility, at least in the mind of readers. I mean, an earlier questioner said to me that, well, you know, Amor is the most self-aware person in the book. And I don't think that's true. I think Anton, her brother, is the most self-aware person in the book. He's not able to behave better as a result, but he knows himself better. There's something about Amor that's a little bit, opaque, I guess, maybe even to herself. So although her impulses move in the correct direction, morally speaking, she's not that unambivalent an example. It takes her 30 years to see the promise through. And there is something a little bit unbalanced and obsessive about the dogged way she just insists on the literal meaning of the promise and the way it should be fulfilled. There may be other solutions to the problem, but she's not open to them. So that is quite a long-winded reply, but I hope it will provide at least some sort of response to that interesting and quite large question.
Thanks, Damon. Yes, no, for sure. We've got another one here, which is from Daria, which goes back to this question of the role of the scripts in helping kind of reorient the way that you were thinking about writing the novel. And she says that my first impression of the novel was how much each section felt like one continuous take, and in contrast, the moments that took place between the sections felt deeply unknowable. Can you speak a bit more about the structure of these vivid moments, separated then by these jumps in time?
Yeah, I mean, what appealed to me initially, what gave me the first idea for the book was, the structure. It was less the family story than the way I would be able to tell the family story. So the architecture of the book was the most interesting thing. I mean, I sort of think all the stories have been told by now. The only possibly unique thing you can bring to it is your mode of narration and your way of telling the story. So the structure of the book was the most intriguing thing. The book begins, the first section begins with Amor, ends with Anton. Amor, youngest daughter, Anton, eldest son. It begins, we begin section 2 with Anton, end with Amor. Section 3 begins with Amor, ends with Anton. 4 begins with Anton, ends with Amor. So in a subliminal way, it's firstly setting them up as the two antagonists or protagonists, however you want to see them in the book. But what it also does, if you end with a particular character, and then when you pick up more or less 10 years later with the same character, the thing you're most aware of is that gap in time, like how much has changed, what you've moved on from, what you've moved to. And as time for me is the real buried subject of the book, that was a very good way of making it, making readers aware of, these large jumps in time. It's only partly related to this, but it does relate to various other points in the book, that I sort of think books that are worthwhile ask something of readers. All writers have had these incredibly irritating Amazon reviews where you get somebody saying, well, I wanted this sort of book and what I got was this sort of book. Well, the book is not there to pleasure you. In a certain sense, you're there to serve the book. I think, if a book is worth something, it's asking you to measure up in some sense and do a little bit of work. And part of the enjoyment and challenge of reading a book is that you have to stretch your mind a little. So I guess what appealed to me is that readers have to fill in those blanks. The questions are not answered really as to what's happened to people in the interim. There are suggestions and gestures in that direction, but you have to imaginatively fill in that space. From that notion, it was just a sort of short lateral hop to the idea that if you space the funerals out enough, you could show something of the changing life of the nation in the background. So those changes, I hope, would register as well. And of course, the gaps in time are not telling you how we arrive there, but history perhaps informs on that score. And sorry, just to loop back to where I began with the structure between Anton and Amor. It's part of my thinking that we begin with Amor and the book ends with Amor. She's of course the one person who doesn't have a section of the book named after her, devoted to her. But in a certain sense, in that sense, the entire book is devoted to her. So, we're not seeing her funeral or her death, but she is really the element that holds this whole story together.
Yeah, I was going to say, getting the section named after you is not necessarily a promising sign for. No. We've got another question here, which actually might lead back into James. I think what you were beginning to ask about, and before we opened up to questions about the role of politics and history in this novel. This one's from Jonathan Kay, who's actually asking about the novel from now on. Do you think that novels written over the last few years, or to be written even now, will reflect the global mood and anxiety of the pandemic in a way that future generations will be able to identify, even if not pandemic specific, which I guess is also getting to a larger question of how history, how events kind of find their way into fiction.
Wow, I mean, that's a question that James is probably better equipped to answer than I am. I mean, insofar as books are a form of exorcism or therapy, I've got no doubt that our current anxieties are going to be expressed in them. But I truly have no clear idea of how that's going to take place. Perhaps, James, you have a theory on this score.
I don't think I have a theory. The only caveat I would add is that whatever form it will come in, it will be more belated than you think, and more indirect. So if you think of 9/11, say, there were some novels that sort of dealt with 9/11, but actually it took some time for books to absorb that impact, and it wasn't always that novels were directly representing that. Sometimes they were, but sometimes they weren't. And I remember when Cormac McCarthy's The Road came out, thinking, okay, yes, this is a dystopian novel set in a hideous future, and it's also some kind of 9/11 novel too. It's some sort of indirect reckoning. The novel takes its own time. I know there'll be other questions, but since we're on sort of history and politics, when people have been talking to you about the book or reviewing it, and you mentioned, some hostility from outside South Africa to the way you deliberately represent Salome, what's the sort of commentary been around what would seem to be a sort of pessimistic, quite profoundly pessimistic streak in the novel, that we end in a South Africa in 2018, in South Africa of sort of corrupt government, water shortages, power outages, and also sort of crucially with members of the Swart family unable to procreate, or unwilling to. What's the commentary been there?
You mean from South Africa specifically?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, the books had, certainly from my point of view, a wonderfully warm reception in South Africa, and I was anxious on that score because you know, there are many people who have reason to be defensive about some of the stuff I'm raising, but actually, I felt very, very well received and very well understood by and large. I guess we all recognize the situation we're in. I mean, it's as simple as that. This is not news to South Africans. And there's always a certain element of relief, I think, when your troubles are named. I mean, I think part of the process of therapy, I mean, to use that as a metaphor, is getting people to name what they feel. Somehow everything becomes more manageable. It's been removed from inside you, and it's on the table. If you can put a name on it, you can see it in a certain sense. And I mean, I'm sucking this out of my thumb, but my sense is that people recognize what they see on the table, basically. And there's a certain element of relief in having it spoken for them and having that trajectory drawn for them. It's one thing to live through this stuff, but you live through it in a tumultuous, you know, not entirely understood, slightly incoherent way. It's quite another thing to have it sort of depicted in, you know, it's clearly what's being depicted isn't orderly, but just the very fact of depiction is bringing a sort of order to things. So, yeah, I mean, I've felt that people appreciate it. As for the bleakness of the vision, I think a great many people have also been relieved by the element of the narrator and the tone of you know, sardonic, ironic mockery that it brings. It's also a form of relief. Things might be unbearable if they're simply in the realm of the tragic, but the narrator provided enough gap, I guess, between the point of view of the reader and the subject material to allow people to laugh a little bit at stuff that we otherwise would suffer through.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, yeah, those lovely lines from King Lear, you know, this is the worst. This is not the worst so long as we can say this is the worst. Right. There's much wisdom in that. Duncan, I'll go back to you if you have any more, if you've harvested any more questions.
Yeah, no, well, one of the questions would be actually a question that I have, which is about some of the interviews you've given since the launch of the book, and the idea that, you know, we're at a moment for not just yourself, but for African writing more general, where prestige culture seems to be recognizing African writers in ways that perhaps it has been ignoring or overlooking writing coming out of all different parts of Africa over recent decades. So, you know, and while that's a good thing, I wonder whether that also brings in this, you know, the problems that we started out hearing you discussing with James, you know, surrounding the sort of the attention that the booker brings. But then there's also, you know, when writers don't win these kinds of prizes, and especially in parts of the world that are distant from the kind of publishing metropolises of New York and London and Paris, you know, does it make you optimistic that this is happening at the moment, or do you worry that this is something that may pass and that it won't kind of lead to sort of longer term structural change?
Yeah, it's hard to know. It's you know, African writers kind of swept the boards last year with, you know, the major literary prizes. And I mean, perhaps it had been remarked on before I mentioned it at the Booker, but I wasn't aware of it having been mentioned. And part of my reason in mentioning it, I guess, was the hope. It's hard to know if this is just a fluke development or whether it actually is the beginning of something. But my hope would be that in vocalizing it, we might make it the beginning of something, by drawing attention to the fact that there is this development that, maybe unprecedented, where African writers have achieved such a concentrated prominence. So, I at least wanted people to think about it in those terms and perhaps to focus on it in a more conscious way. At least half of that was not directed outward at, the West and Western publishing and reading, which, is resistant, I guess, in all sorts of ways to the notion of novels from Africa. But internally, the resistance to novels from Africa is very much embedded in Africa too. I would sort of point up the fact that the first English review I got in South Africa for my book only came after its Booker shortlisting. And without the Booker shortlisting, I doubt it would have been reviewed in South Africa at all. I don't feel singled out in that way, which is part of the problem. There simply is not a serious attention to the idea of anything worthwhile coming out of South Africa. And I guess I'm guilty of that too. My first experience of reading Coetzee was when I was about 18 or 19, and I happened to come across a copy of In the Heart of the Country, and I read it, and I can remember that my overwhelming feeling of excitement was very much partly rooted in the realization that this is world-class writing and it comes from here. And it was a surprise to me. So, that realization has to be seized, I think, in some conscious way to be carried forward. And I hope the world and Africa will do that to whatever degree. I'm skeptical that it'll happen. The South African Arts and Culture Department, moribund at the best of times, has yet to acknowledge the fact that the Booker was won by a South African. I don't mind in any personal sense, but I mind in the more general sense that, African governments are really not invested in creating a reading culture or in promoting their own writers and stories. And until that changes, a great many other things are not going to change either.
I wonder whether that, leads to another question about the difficulty of, say, writing under the sort of the complexity of the post-optimism, the post, in the case of South Africa, post-apartheid, but in other parts of Africa, post-independence moments, when I know that you've said in the past about your theatre writing, how South African theatre was kind of animated by a spirit of resistance, that staging plays under apartheid was part of what gave the theatre its kind of energy and import. And whether it's like, there's something about learning how to write in that moment with far more complexity, and something that I think The Promise does very, very well. And honestly, even as James mentioned, sometimes somewhat pessimistically, is something that is an aspect of this.
Yeah, probably the greatest achievements of South African literature have come out of that period of resistance. Coetzee and Gordon are both. Andre Brink, Njabula and Ndebele. There are a great many strong books that came out of that South African period, and they were all books that were basically taking a stand against power and injustice. The moment apartheid fell, that whole terrain altered, and it became much more ambiguous and very much harder to read, because it was an entirely new government, entirely new laws on the statute books, and an entirely new future which was unknown to all of us and is still being worked out, I guess. And along with it, you know, the new rules of literature are being worked out. I sort of saw that in a certain sense when I wrote The Good Doctor. For me, that was a book that I was certainly trying to break away from the tradition of resistance literature and to open up or reflect this new terrain where morality is far more ambiguous and cryptic and hard to read. So, you know, there are certainly things to resist in South Africa now again, but there's no sense of that sort of gathering momentum of resistance where you know, that you have maybe in the situation with Ukraine at the moment, where everybody is resolved and decided. There was that sort of unambiguous, coherent moral response to apartheid, and writing was very much part of that. Things are far more difficult now. I mean, the heroes of yesterday are, you know, have become partly villainous and open to question, and the old moral rules are, you know, full of holes, and you know, yeah, it's just a gray and shifting terrain now, and writing in a certain sense is fumbling in the wind, trying to find a place to plant its flag. But still, it's if you separate yourself from the human abrasions and calamity that are involved in this historical process, it's rich pickings for a writer. You know, there are great themes, and what's more, they're real themes in the sense that quite a lot is at stake.
I think that's a wonderful place to end. There's no question on any page of your novel that things aren't at stake, aren't at the highest stakes. Damon, it's been a real pleasure. Duncan, thank you for introducing us both, and to the Mahindra for hosting us. Thank you again. It's been a delight.
Thank you. Delight for me too.
Good night.